I wonder if you could help us and our listeners kind of weave the threads together. So, can you both talk about where restorative justice and narrative change meet and kind of how are they in conversation with each other?
Ashley, I was actually curious if I could ask you a question
Sure.
to get this started. And I'm wondering, could you tell me about the story behind why you do what you do right now? Like,
Mm.
why do you do restorative justice?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll thank you for asking for the story. So I'll give a quick synopsis of what I think is probably two parts to this story. Is when I was in college, I really had a transformative encounter. I was a sports management major. But my heart always knew I wanted to work with young people, and I had to keep a scholarship I had. This is my freshman year. I had to take like one more credit, and I took this juvenile justice seminar. And the second day of the seminar, our professor took us to Joliet IYC, which was like considered like a maximum secure juvenile kind of prison. And it was like my first, yeah, I was the only young woman on the taking the course, and I was the only Black person. And I remember touring the facility, and these young people, saw a young person. I remember him being like 10 or 11 at the time, shackled. And a part of this tour, they was like, do y'all want to see what was considered like the shoe? It was solitary confinement. And my mind couldn't wrap around children in solitary confinement. It didn't make sense to me. And so as we are journeying to the shoe, I thought it was going to be empty because why would you take people to see young people in these cages? But to my surprise, we're on this unit, and each set of doors I pass, another face appears. And it literally felt like something out of a movie because I was like, maybe this is not real. But by the time I get to the end of the unit, I look down and there is nothing but Black and brown faces at the doors. And something shifted in me then. It was like, you have something to do with these young people. And I really didn't know what it was, but what I did know was that they were trapped inside of this system. And when I say system, structurally, not just inside of this literal institution, but I think like the systems that destroyed our neighborhoods too. Because I was hearing stories of young people who would get off, they would get sent home on a train and they would commit a crime when they got to the city just to be sent back because they had nowhere to go. And it really shifted in something in me. And I was like, there has to be a more healing paradigm that interrupts this cycle before they even get here. And I didn't know what that looked like. And I met a good brother, Mashawn Hendricks, who was my big brother's friend. And long story short, he introduced me to some people working with young people. And they asked me to take this training, this restorative justice training. I was like, I don't know what this is. And Cheryl Graves, Pamela Purdy, Aura Shrub of Chicago, that's where I'm from. I took this training with them, and it was like a fire had been lit. And I was like, this is it. To sit in a process in a circle and to understand for the first time what it fully meant to be seen, to have space to tell your story, to have space to understand why someone has done what they've done, and to understand that as a whole person, you're not just what you did. It was transformative for me. And I was like, I remember the last day a woman walked up to me from the training because it was all these mothers who were part of this training from the south side of Chicago. And she said, this is going to be the work you do. And I didn't know because nobody I knew had ever really been doing this work in the world. But I knew that like whatever I touch, I want to do it in a circle. whatever I do, I want to do it like this because I felt myself being transformed in that moment. And I knew that if it could happen that way, that on a larger scale, we could transform communities. We can transform the lives of young people if we gave them space. And so I think that like that was why I started doing the work that I was doing, because Octavia Butler says, all that you touch, you change, and all that changes you. And I was changed. And I knew that the little girl in me needed this, and so many other young people. And the more I did it, I realized, like, oh, this is for all of us. And so that's the story of how I got into restorative justice and why I fell in love with it as a process, as a way of being, as a tool for liberation and freedom, and as a different paradigm for what our young people could encounter, before they reach the system.
Ashley, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I'm not surprised to learn that you and I share a lot in common. A lot of similarities in the narrative arc that you're sharing.
Mhm.
I oftentimes think about the power of storytelling as a
Mhm.
time traveling
Yes.
conduit mechanism, and you had me traveling as you were sharing. And of course, I mean, at the same time, we do have different positionalities, and there's different ways that I'm sure that you and I experience the world. But the places where I just found some immediate commonalities and that I think invite me to also and answer this question around where does storytelling, narrative change, restorative justice intertwine? Well, first and foremost, in the embodiment of what you just did, right? Like you sharing a story about your own journey of transformation and rooted on healing, rooted on reciprocity, rooted on feeling whole and well and in just relationship. And for me, giving a narrative, right, to that process that allows us to metabolize it, that allows us to see it as core to who we are, past, present, and future, is so essential to healing. I, not unlike you, envision myself also working with young people when I was young. That kind of comes from my ancestry because I come from a family of educators. So I always envision myself as an educator. Nevertheless, as an undocumented person in this country, the pathway into being a classroom educator was just not there for me.
Mhm.
So I found other ways to do youth work and education work. And in many ways, my pathway, above all, was through community organizing. And I used to think I arrived into community organizing work from a place of anger, right? Experiencing and not to say that there was no anger or that there was no fear or that there was no tremendous trauma along my journey, facing all kinds of injustices, all kinds of marginalization, just witnessing all kinds of horrible things happening to immigrant communities, to Black and Brown communities, to queer communities. I mean, that anger was there. But I think really above all, what was there for me was I believe in dignity. Like
Mhm.
just deep down, I believe that it shouldn't be that way. I think early on in my community organizing work, I envisioned storytelling first and foremost as an act of resistance, as an act of defiance, to say these this way in which you've structured schools, this way in which you've structured how we conceptualize quote unquote public safety, this way in which you've conceptualized who gets to have access to healthcare, and this way in which you conceptualize who gets to have an ID that allows them to claim belonging and or access to any type of public service. Just it really a call to say that's broken. That's not holding all of us. And unfortunately, while there was some sense of empowerment in getting engaged civically, and a lot of my community organizing work early on involved working with other young undocumented people. And so many of our stories follow a very similar narrative arc. And it was always, at the time, it seemed to me like this plea for belonging, right? Like, let us belong with you in these systems that you've created. And if you make these adjustments, right, then we could graduate from high school. We could go to colleges. We could have access to healthcare. We could have driver licenses. We could. And these persistent resistance to being dehumanized and persistent resistance to being told, no, get out of here, right? You don't belong here. And this pleading for allow us to show you how we can embody the proverbial American dream. There was empowerment in that, but there was also a lot of numbness. There was
Mm-hmm.
also a lot of disassociation. There was also a lot of compartmentalization. There was also a lot of trauma. And it was very confusing for me as a young person. I'm like 17, 18, 19. I'm working with others to tell these stories in front of our senators or representatives, city council, school boards. And we are, by the way, getting some tangible material policy changes done. And I was so confused how these small victories and these moments that felt so empowering, telling our stories, at the same time had me feeling so numb, so disconnected. And I began to realize that storytelling as resistance, while important and part of our legacy, it's not ultimately, it's not ultimately what's going to hold us. Because I don't want a life of resistance, right? Like that's not ultimately what I want. I don't want a life of performance also. I don't want to have to perform for a system to see me and acknowledge finally that I'm what I've always been, human and whole and worthy. And I saw that happen so much with so many other young people that I was working with. And again, not unlike you, it was in a circle. Uh, in not in a legislative setting, not in a public hearing. It was in a circle, in a forest, in a retreat, being held by educators who were deeply committed to liberation, who were deeply committed. Before I had this language, right, like restorative justice, belonging, like that embodied that, right, and held space for me to feel seen and to feel whole for the first time in a long time. And the shift for me in that moment, right, being in this circle, was essentially saying it's not storytelling as a practice of resistance that we need to be committed to. It's a storytelling as a practice of liberation.
Ashe. Mm-hmm.
And that requires healing.
Yes.
So that to me is where it intertwines, right? That narrative change. And my biggest critique, right, of narrative change efforts that I see in our larger ecosystem is that many of them are very obsessed with what is the right message, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or what is the right story, quote unquote, that's going to get us to um, achieve that particular narrative shift that we may want in a particular context. And there's the relational, right? It's not there. So it requires healing. So for me, restorative justice and narrative change are intertwined if we are deeply committed to liberation.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for naming and for sharing that story. I think since the moment I've encountered you, even without knowing you, and I've have felt deeply aligned and interconnected. I think our souls know one another from the past or something. I feel every time I'm with you, I feel like I know you know you. But when you talk about like storytelling as resistance, but not just as resistance, but as a tool for liberation, for healing. One of the things that came to my mind is Lucille Clifton has a poem, I think it's called Sometimes They Be Mad. But in the poem, there's this piece that in it, if I'm remembering correctly, it's like they ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep remembering mine. And I think about storytelling when you talk about as healing, it is a storytelling really is an ancestral technology that calls us into remembrance, right? When colonization has told us a narrative about ourselves, storytelling becomes the way that we get to return back to ourselves, right? That we get to remember that life beyond struggle, resistance, right? Life beyond oppression, life beyond, and we get to take back, right, our power too in the way we tell our story by practicing it. I always talk about how when I first got introduced to this work, it was not, and I think they were intentional, and I give homage to my elder, Cheryl Grace, Pamela Purdy, Ora Shrub, Ora Shub, who when introduced to this work, it was not introduced to me as restorative justice. It was a peacemaking circle training, right? We were in this practice of circles. And the thing that drew me in was the stories. Seeing, literally witnessing people shift in their seats about the way they told a story. You know, that one day you can show up and tell this story and with your whole heart see yourself one way, right? For an example, right? You may see yourself as somebody who feels powerless. And by the time we finish this process, you can tell this exact same story in a very different way and understand how powerful you are, right? Because you're remembering, right? That this is a technology. And that's why when you say, like, I think any tools that are used for liberation can also be used for oppression, even the circle, if not done with intention and if not done with spirit. And so when I think about the interconnection of these two, I think that in indigenous practices, justice came by way of relationships and story. And, you know, we're in a new time and we're remembering what has always been in new ways. And they are meeting each other, right? And I think activating something within our communities that says that not only do we get to be warriors, the resistance, but we also get to be healers. And I think that Dr. Fania Davis talks a lot about that as well in her work as a restorative justice practitioner, advocate, that like we can't just be warrior, but we also have to be healer, and that they get to be two sides of the same coin. So all that to say, thank you for bringing that into the space. And so, yeah, I'm digress there.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And again, so yes, our souls have known each other. That much I know. And I think once again, I mean, there's so much that you're offering that deeply resonates with me, and I'll briefly connect it to part of the introduction that Crystal did at the beginning of the podcast around my thinking and understanding around how stories, narratives, systems, structures, mental models, how all of that is connected, right? And I think back to your story that you were sharing with us and your reaction to seeing the violence of a carceral system, right? Like materially, structurally, right there. And I think about, right, like what are the stories that told over time became narratives,
Mm-hmm.
cross generations became mental models that combine with material power turn into structures and policies and systems that make it possible for children, and especially Black and Brown children, to be caged as a matter of legal practice, backed even by a moral claim. I mean, I think about so much of what's unfolding around us right now and the narrative behind it that those claim to use quote unquote moral language and legal language, this is what's right for quote unquote us language, that justifies the disappearance of people, the public execution of people, the removal of people. And across history, that practice has been there since colonization times. And that's the place, right, where, to your point, like we do need resistance, right? We do need those stories that remind us, first of all, that resistance has always existed, right? This has never been a passive process. It's never been, here's the brutal, violent dominance of a group, and then things just went forward from there. There's always been a pushback. There's always been a movement that calls into question that tremendous act of violence and pushes back against it. And the difficult balancing act there is, how do we fight while at the same time hold on to our humanity? When I say humanity, I mean our collective humanity. That's perhaps like one of the most persistent ongoing tensions that I faced in my work. I so appreciate you naming that many of these tools, strategies, tactics, practices, right, that we bring into our work with the intention of liberation and care and just relationship can also be deployed to harm, to destroy, right? That like a circle facilitated with the intention of remove humanity follows many of the same facilitator moves that I would use to create a circle that restores us into each other, right? And restores us in humanity. So I always, oftentimes think of stories as fire, right? Like fire can be nourishing. Fire can be, it's intertwined with our history as humanity, right? It's ancestral. We gather around fire to tell stories. I like to imagine that the first story ever told happened like that. A group of people around a fire telling a story about what unfolded, and then memory began, and everything else began to unfold since then. And across so many indigenous cultures, like there's these beautiful interconnection with fire, right? Like the fire keepers. Who does that? Who tends to it? And fire can destroy.
Yes.
So for me, it's a question of who wields it, who wields the fire, and a sacred responsibility that I hold on to, and that I'm perpetually in tension with. And I want to be clear that when I say tension, I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for me to experience these tensions and ask myself critical questions about what does it mean to facilitate this work, knowing and holding myself accountable to this work and to liberation. And this is where, and I'm wondering perhaps like if you could then tell me what holds you as you do this work, because if we are keepers of fire, right? And if we are keepers of these approaches and practices that we know can bring healing, what is the principle or what grounds you as you do the work to remain rooted in the practice?
So two things come up for me. One of them is the ancestors, my ancestors. Anytime I'm doing this work, I do it in my circle and RJ lineage, but I also do it within the lineage of my bones. And so when I think about who I am accountable to, I'm first accountable to the people I come from, right? Yeah. And I when I say I don't have a process that is absent of spirit, is because they are the ones who I call in to support me in these spaces. And that may be different for some people, right? But I wouldn't do anything, one, that disrespects my lineage or the lineage of anybody who is present in the room. And I think the second thing is, and this is something, a principle that I also brought to IRL, is that I don't ask folks to do nothing that I'm not willing. And so accountability for me is that if I'm in a practice with you, right? I'm not doing this for, if I'm in a practice with you, I also have to be willing to engage in the same, right, critical reflection. I have to be willing to engage in doing whatever the hard thing is. I have to be willing to be held accountable when we're doing this. And I think that when we started the IRL work, it was something that I really wanted to not just tell them, but embody, that this isn't something that you're doing for the fellows or for IRL. If you're not willing to engage in it yourself, then to have an expectation for somebody else to do that and then wonder why things aren't working when you're not working it either. For me, I think that is something that holds me, right? Is that I have a responsibility to this fire. But to know this fire, I have to know my own. I have to know my own fire, right? Or else the responsibility that I have is that I'll burn myself and other people who are in the room. And now, where this tool, even by me, being held, not just a tool, but this practice that is held by even me, if I'm not accountable, then I cause more harm than good. And now you're experiencing what now can be a tool again, right? Of oppression. You're experiencing something that is going to cause harm, right? If I was somebody who took the stories of the folks in circle and I go tell them to somebody else or write about them and being extractive, right? That's a tool of colonization. That's what they've been doing, right? And so we can replicate those if we aren't doing the work ourselves. And for me, I always try to, in my community, I have folks who are in the rooms with me too. So like if I'm doing something that I wouldn't do, like they get to call me in as well, and so I want to be accountable to the people I come from, the people I stand with, and I want to be accountable to myself, knowing that I'm not doing harm intentionally, to anyone who has trusted me with this process, trusted me with a circle, trusted me with their yes. And so that's how I hold that.